Hello, this is Michael Hart. I'm host of the Michael Hart Show as well as the Unknown America podcast, which can be found on the Heart of America Broadcasting Network. I'm also the author of the book Unknown America, Myths and Little Known Oddities about the greatest nation on earth. Whether in the books or the podcast or public speaking engagements or even on our daily radio program, we break down the news of the day through the prism of the past. I firmly believe that if you don't have a good grasp of American history and everything that's going on in the past, whether it's 200 years ago or just 25 minutes ago, it's very difficult to understand exactly what's happening in this country today. Now, this is an ongoing series that we do. We've got the Heart of America YouTube channel, of course, the podcast, Unknown America. We've also got the daily program, the books, and all the other things that we do. One of the things that I wanted to share in today's episode, since it actually is the second day of March, is an event that occurred on this date in 1877. And I think you understand exactly with the political climate that we're in today, what happened in 1877 in the presidential election of 1876. You get a much better idea of things like brokered conventions, the behind the scenes wrangling that sometimes accompanies presidential politics, and sometimes some of the, shenanigans that go on. A lot of things that we talk about are never reported in our history classes. They're not taught in school. We do them in our seminars, but far too many people in this country simply are not aware of everything that takes place in our history that has impacted the news cycle today and what this country is dealing with. First off, before we get started, I hope you'll check us out every Monday through Friday at 8 Eastern in the morning, or that's 7 Central at Heart, H-A-R-T, heartofamerica.net. You have to go back basically to the time of the Civil War. Of course, Abraham Lincoln emancipates the slaves, then is assassinated. Andrew Johnson, his vice president, takes over. In 1869, we have the election post-Civil War. We get the beginnings of the Reconstruction Era. And we have Reconstruction, of course, going on all across the Deep South, which is where this program is actually originating from. And that takes the better part of about 10 years or so. Grant is elected president in 1869. And 8 years later, although he could have, he decides not to run for a third term. He's clearing the way right now for a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes is actually a Republican, obviously. And then we have a guy by the name of Samuel Tilden. Now, Tilden used to be the governor, of New York. He went up against Rutherford B. Hayes in a very, very heated election. There was a lot of chatter about fraud and polling issues and intimidation and things of this nature. But at the end of the election in 1876, it turns out that Rutherford B. Hayes has lost the popular vote as well as the electoral vote to Samuel Tilden. Tilden's got about 184 electoral votes to 165 for Rutherford B. Hayes. This begins a real uneasy period in American presidential politics and history. And the reason for this is during Reconstruction, there was 3 states in particular that still had federal troops in them to maintain the peace and order during the Reconstruction period. They were Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Towards the closing months even, of Grant's tenure, he begins to withdraw the troops out of Florida, making way for, some additional troops are actually down in the Panhandle, but making way for the country to kind of hopefully heal the divides and chasms that took place. Now, because the states were still, obviously in the Deep South, but they were still to some degree in opposition to the federal government, there was some confusion, and add Oregon into the mix as well, although for a different reason. There was some confusion as to what to do with the delegates out of the Electoral College that most people know ultimately is the one that votes the president into office and not the popular vote. So here we have Rutherford B. Hayes. He's behind by 19 votes. And we have the troops being drawn out of the state of Florida, but they were still in Louisiana and South Carolina. The debate's going back and forth as to what to do. And at the convention, they couldn't quite figure out when the denominating convention was going to take place to make the determination as to who would be president of the United States with the electoral votes from these now 4 states, with 20 of them belonging to, again, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Again, Grant's pulled the troops out of Florida, but at least 2 states behind. With all the contention and infighting going on, there's a deal that's struck by the United States Congress that if Samuel Tilden will step down, they will take the 20 electoral votes and grant them to Rutherford B. Hayes, but making him the president by one vote, one electoral vote. But that's called the Compromise of 1877. Now it's pretty much unofficial. So why would Samuel Tilden step down and give away an election that he had won the electoral vote on, as well as the popular vote on? He could have fought it in a court of law, although the popular vote would not have been justification for winning that court case. The Congress had no idea how to disperse and distribute the electors from those 3 highly contested states. So here was the deal. Tilden says he'll step down in a matter of 3 or 4 different concessions. Number one, that the newly minted or inaugurated Rutherford B. Hayes, actually the list is simply the removal of all U.S. military personnel from all of the Confederate states, again, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Florida had already moved on. Number 2 was the appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet. In this case, it was a guy by the name of David Key from Kentucky. Those 2 conditions were actually met. In addition to that, number 3 is the construction of another transcontinental railway using the Texas and Pacific in the South and been part of what was called the Scott Plan. Number 3 never came to fruition. Then there was legislation to help industrialize the South and restore the economy following the Reconstruction of the United States, of the Southern United States during the Civil War and the Reconstruction years. So what is the motivation by Tilden? Tilden wants all federal troops between the Northern carpetbaggers in the Deep South and residents of the Confederate States of America. And so we had the removal of all of these federal troops, and upon their removal, a group called the Redeemer Democrats take control of the Deep South. There was still a lot of division between the North and the South at this period of time. So why in the world would Samuel Tilden and the Democrat Party allow Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, to take over an election that they won on the electoral side and the popular vote side? Simply enough, it was because of the power of the Deep South. At the time of the end of Reconstruction, which is in 1877, roughly speaking, we see the introduction, the full-fledged introduction of the Jim Crow era. Now, although Jim Crow had begun more or less, or the framework, any of it, had begun approximately 10 years prior, we receive a full implementation of Jim Crow in the Deep South, led by the Redeemer Democrats and Samuel Tilden for the purposes of consolidating their power in the South. They literally gave up the White House so that they could keep the black population in check in the United States of America. Now, all the federal troops have been taken back to Washington, D.C., or dispersed across the northern states. The South is left to fend for itself. The Compromise of 1877 takes over. Jim Crow is implemented, and we are on a collision course with what would eventually become known as the Civil Rights Movement, eventually reaching a crescendo, particularly in the Deep South, in the 1960s. This is one of the most misunderstood periods of American history. Some on the left have screamed the Republicans bailed out on the South and the protection of the African-American community, which I guess technically you could make the argument that was part of what was being considered. But there's also the aspect that it was the Democrats that purposely gave up the White House just for the ability to be able to hold on to the Deep South, knowing that had Tilden, despite the fact that he was a New Yorker and a Yankee, despite that fact that they would probably have not been able to maintain their independence and what they perceived to be their quasi-sovereignty in the post-Reconstruction era in the United States. It's also interesting to note that that also was somewhat of a precedent or a precursor to some of the other contested conventions that we've had in this country. And frankly, in the year 2020, we might be looking at another one. But at the end of the day, it's very important to understand the impact of the Compromise of 1877, where a political party stood down away from a major U.S. victory for the purposes of implementing their very prejudiced views on the Deep South, maintaining control of their quasi-slaveholding ways. Obviously, the African American community have been emancipated, at least legally speaking. But things did not improve for the Black community in the Deep South for many, many, many decades to come. Compliments of the Redeemer Democrats and people that hold many, in my opinion, of the same opinions and viewpoints to this very day. Check out the podcast at heartofamerica.net. That's heartofamerica.net. You can listen to us right there on heartofamerica.net every single day. We're live 7 o'clock in the morning Central Time. If you're in Central Alabama, we are on 1260 AM, 92.5 FM, as well as 95.3 FM. You can also find out more about going to the books over at theunknownamerica.com. Whole host of different ways to check us out. If you happen to be seeing this video, wherever you might be, I'd love for you to consider subscribing to the Heart of America YouTube channel so that we can continue to go through some of these lessons of history, because there is an awful lot of history in the past, and we do need to break down the news cycle in this country through the prism of the past, lest we forget, because as George Santayana is fond of saying, those that do not remember the past, well, they're pretty much doomed to repeat it. This has been Michael Hart right here with the Unknown America Project. Thanks for stopping by.